Good evening.
Good evening, Rabbi. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Do you have snow in where you are?
No. I don't know what it is in Celsius, but about 65 degrees right now outside. Beautiful sunny day.
Well, half of America's got 90-degree temperatures, and the other half has got 3 feet of snow.
That's right. Well,
God is finally fed up with mankind.
or at least some parts of it. I don't know.
He's given up on us entirely, leaving us to our own devices.
I take it it's seasonably cold in Montreal.
It's actually winter used to be 6 months, and now if it's 2 months, it's a lot. So I like winter. So if you ask
Me too. I agree with you 100%.
If you ask the snowbirds, they'll disagree with me entirely. But so we've had a very short winter.
Are you a lifelong Montreal resident?
I am, yes.
Beautiful.
Where's this rabbi from?
Rabbi, remind me where you're from. My husband was just asking me.
I am originally from Rochester, New York. At the moment, I live in Dallas, Texas.
Oh, lovely. Did you see? I was shocked and horrified when Houston was inundated by a storm several years ago. Did you see the result of that catastrophic?
Yes, we went down to help people clean up. Absolutely.
Did they recover from that properly?
I think many people did. Now when they build houses there, they build them, 10 feet off the ground.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But the mildew and the mold and the spores and the stuff that's bad for your health.
No, absolutely.
Families that have no money.
It's interesting. The especially the Orthodox community there has really exploded the past couple of years because ultimately it's hard to argue with cheap real estate prices.
So are you saying people fled their rotted homes and other people went in and scooped them up? Could be.
Yeah. Or build new ones with
with stilts.
That follow the new regulations.
How many Jews in Dallas?
We have some Dallasites on the line. I heard something like 70,000 in the area. Some Janice, is that right?
I can't tell you that for sure, but that's probable.
Something like that.
Yeah, between Dallas and Fort Worth and north. Yeah. So we could say how many Chabads do we have?
I think they say they're up to, what is it, 14, 15? I don't know. I mean,
they're extraordinary guys.
Yeah. Okay, let's see. Still dialing in. In a few moments.
Rabbi, is 7 o'clock what we're doing? Bold, brilliant, and banned?
So that's correct. That's what you're on for, right?
Yeah, because on the email from Madeleine Roy,
that's Montreal time. Did it say 8 o'clock?
It says 8.
Correct. In Montreal, it's 8. Remember, we're doing this together with, or under the auspices of Shar HaShamayim in Montreal, and we just adjusted it for our time for our members. So you're on. You're good to go. If you know of anybody who thinks that it's at 8 o'clock Dallas time, you should email, text, or tell them otherwise in the next 2 minutes before we begin.
Rabbi, heard a fascinating lecture this morning about the Jews of Africa.
Oh, wow.
The Black Jews.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay.
And that there could be something like 20 million of them.
They could. I believe it.
Can you imagine if our tiny little nation of 15 million is actually many, many, many more than that?
Could double our numbers instantly.
Well, let me blow your mind. It turns out that many of the Talibans have genetic signature of being Jewish that traced back to the dispersion of Jews after Babylon.
I believe that too. Maybe that's a subject for a different lecture series.
We may want to invite the Grand Mullah or something.
Jews who are the Taliban and Taliban who are Jews.
There you go.
It would be a story of failed parenting.
or very successful assimilation. Okay.
Jews who were part of Taliban?
Well,
No.
there's so many people who were Jewish 1,000 years ago who've been Christian so long that even amongst the Taliban, you'd find some genetic relationship to the Jewish people, I guess. Can believe anything today.
And they have also similar rituals that mimic Jewish rituals.
For sure. Okay. I think that we can get started. Let me just pin myself.
3 hours.
I'm going to
No.
mute everyone, but everybody has the ability to unmute themselves. They want to ask questions and can send the questions once again for those that are new. Feel free to send questions by chat, but it may take a moment or a couple of minutes for me to answer them. 1 second. All right. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining. This is the final talk in this series. And as we said before, there are plenty more books that we could discuss. Perhaps if the Shar is good enough to invite me back, we can do this another time or deal with a different subject entirely. I look forward to seeing what there is in store. I really enjoyed studying together with you. And let's begin. I'm just going to share the screen. Second view is...
Rabbi, are you a graduate of Rabbi Weiss's yeshiva?
I am not. I am a graduate of Yeshiva University, where I was also ordained.
Thank you.
The way I know Rabbi Shire is that we grew up together. All right.
Where? Is that Toronto?
In Rochester, New York.
Rochester. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Today we're going to talk about a fascinating and controversial episode and controversial work, and that is the Orot. Orot is the work that is widely considered, in fact, considered by perhaps Rav Kook himself to be one of his most important. And we'll talk about why it is important and why it was controversial as we go. Just to give a little bit of a background, Rav Kook, 1 second, was born in 1865. He was born in Griva in Latvia, He was born into a rabbinic family. His father's name was Rav Shlomo Zalman HaKohen Kook, and his father was a student of the Volozhin Yeshiva, and he was the eldest. Rav Kook was the eldest of 8 children. Even to this very day, the Kook family is an extensive family, particularly in Israel, and many of them are descendants of Rav Kook's siblings. As we'll see, Rav Kook himself did not have a large family or many descendants necessarily, but those whose last name is Kook and are Kohanim are all related to Rav Kook and are descended from his siblings. And from a young age, he had the reputation of being a genius, especially in his studies of Talmud. He was an Eloi, the term is Eloi, a Talmudic genius. And he was also known for his diligence. He would study for 18 hours a day in the Beit Midrash, in the study hall of the Volozhin Yeshiva, where he attended. He was a prize student of Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhin Yeshiva, and reportedly said that if he had started the yeshiva for only one student, if amidst the many hundreds of students that passed through the Volozhin Yeshiva, it would have been worth it just for one student like Rav Avram Yitzchak HaKohen Kook. He was really a tremendously innovative person and a diligent student of Torah. And in 1886, he married he married Alta Bat Sheva, the daughter of Rav Eliyahu David Rabinowitz Tumim, that's him on the left, Rav Eliyahu David Rabinowitz Tumim, who was the rabbi of Panovich. In time, he became the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, of the Adafridas, and he was known as the Aderet. For those Dallasites find this amusing because we have a kosher restaurant here named Aderet, but that's that actually is the acronym of his name, Eliyahu David Rabinowitz Tumim, Aderet. That's how he was known, and he was the head of the Eda Acharedis, and unfortunately, about 2 years later, she died. Alta Bat Sheva passed away. She left Rav Kook with a young daughter. At the encouragement of her father, of the Aderes, the father of the late of his late wife, Rav Kook marries his late wife's first cousin. Her name was Reza Rivka, and she was the daughter of Rav Eliyahu David's twin brothers. So he is married. His second wife is the first cousin of his first wife. And together they have 4 children. They have 2 daughters that die in their youth. Their names were Ruchama Taiba and Esther Yael. Ruchama Taiba, I think, died of an illness. Esther Yael, Lo Aleinu, died while falling from a flight of stairs outside Rav Kook's home. Another daughter, Batya Miriam, lived to adulthood, and she married someone named Rav Shalom Ra'anan. They had a son named Rav Tzvi Yehuda HaKohen Kook, who was the heir of Rav Kook and the perpetuator of his ideological legacy. And there is another daughter, the Rav Kook's daughter from his first marriage, whose name was Freda Chana. And she married a relative whose name was Rav Yisrael Rabinowitz Tumim. He was, I think, Rav Kook's brother-in-law. The brother, so in essence, this woman married her first cousin, right? It was not her uncle; it was her first cousin. So this is Rav Kook's family. Rav Kook becomes the Rav of Zalmal and later the Rav of Boisk. Both of these places are in Lithuania, and eventually he is invited in 1904 to be the chief rabbi of Yaffo. This is what Yaffo looked like in the early 1900s. You can see that there is there's an old city as well, right on the water, and the chief rabbinate of Yaffo included responsibility for the nearby Moshavim, which were secular, and because they were secular and it was the early 1900s, they were often anti-religious. Rav Kook spent a lot of his life engaged in outreach to these the people working the land, the Moshavim, as we'll see. This figures quite a bit into the controversy later on surrounding this word. Rav Kook travels to Europe, and World War I breaks out, and he finds himself stuck first in Switzerland and then in London, in Whitechapel for several years. That was the old Jewish neighborhood. Now it is a heavily Pakistani neighborhood. But back then, the East End was like what we would call in New York would be the Lower East Side. In Montreal, it would be the Mile End. I don't know whatever the old neighborhood was in Montreal. That's what it was like. That was what Whitechapel was like. And he was the rabbi of the Machzikei Hadas community, a community that still exists. That shul still exists, albeit in a different location. And when he returns to the land of Israel, he is named the chief Ashkenazic rabbi of the land of Israel. Now, there had been Ashkenazi rabbis of Yerushalayim for many years, and there had been chief Sephardic rabbis of the land of Israel for many years. That's the term Rishon LeZion. The title that's applied to the chief Sephardic rabbi of the state of Israel is actually a term that dates back to the time of the Ottoman Empire. The same way that in the Ottoman Empire, they had what they called a Chacham Bashi, the chief rabbi. They had the chief rabbi of the land of Israel was called the Rishon, the first LeZion of Zion, of Zion, and that position goes back many hundreds of years, including, as does the special outfit worn, the robes. If you see what the Sephardic chief rabbis wear, that also is of a significant vintage as well. But Rav Kook was the chief Ashkenazic rabbi of the land of Israel, the first person to hold that title. Now, while he's there, he's in Yerushalayim, he develops a movement he has the idea to start a movement, a social movement, a religious movement called Degel Yerushalayim. And he opens the yeshiva to advance its ideals. And the idea was that living in the land of Israel demands a different approach to Torah study, a different approach to Jewish life. And it requires a unified movement, a central yeshiva and a central Beit Din, one centralized authority, a chief rabbinate as well. And this is where the yeshiva that maybe you've heard of called Merkaz Harav started. Down here, you see where the original Merkaz Harav yeshiva was. And up here, you see that this is what the yeshiva looks like today. This is Merkaz Harav. Some of the great rabbinic luminaries of this day were the students of Rav Kook. Like, for example, Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap. He was the rabbi of the Sharei Chesed neighborhood. You may be familiar if you go to Yerushalayim now. Sharei Chesed is a posh neighborhood. When my grandmother was growing up in Yerushalayim, Sharei Chesed, my grandmother grew up poor in the neighborhood called Knesset in Yerushalayim. And but Sharei Chesed, that was where the really poor people lived. Like they didn't even, my grandmother, they had indoor plumbing and they had indoor facilities. But in Sharei Chesed, they had none of those things. That was a really poor neighborhood. And the Rav of that neighborhood was Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap. Now it's full of second homes for wealthy, wealthy foreigners. But back then, that it was absolutely very much of an impoverished neighborhood. The rabbi was Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap. He was Rav Kook's right-hand man, and he would succeed Rav Kook as well as the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz Harav, and he actually had his own yeshiva as well called Beit Zevul. Rav Kook was a prolific writer. He wrote about Jewish philosophy. He wrote about Jewish law. Rav Kook was a posek. He wrote about Agadic passages in the Talmud, and it's interesting because whereas in the realm of his philosophy, as we'll see, he was viewed as something of a renegade or a revolutionary, when it came to his halachic thinking, he was very much conservative. So, for example, in envisioning what a Jewish state should look like, he was opposed, at least initially, or at least ideally, I should say, to women voting or being voted for. He felt that. So just to give you an idea, that he was in many cases, lowercase conservative, even as he was somewhat avant-garde in his thinking. Many of the rabbis living in Jerusalem at the time viewed Rav Kook's arrival and his appointment as great news. One of them was Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, who was the Av Beit Din, the head of the rabbinical court in Jerusalem. Another one was someone named Rav Yechiel Michal Tikochinsky. Many people know nothing about Rav Tikochinsky, except that oftentimes if you look at times, like if you want to look at the time for when a fast ends, you'll often find that the earliest possible time is according to the view of Rav Yechiel Michal Tikochinsky. That's what most people know him as. But he was a fascinating person, a supporter of Rav Kook, and he was an important rabbi in Yerushalayim and Jerusalem as well. But there was also another element that was opposed to his appointment and was opposed to what he stood for. Not everybody viewed his arrival with unalloyed enthusiasm. Here we have, here's a picture of what it looked like we call the Yishuv Hayashan. These are people who lived in Jerusalem, in the old city in particular, for many, many generations. And they affiliated with the community known as the Eda HaCharedis, that exists to this very day. They are extraordinarily stridently anti-Zionist. They don't take any money from the state for their institutions, for their communal organizations, but the institution of the Eda Haredis predates the state by a long, long time. And many of the people, the families who are affiliated with the Eda Haredis have lived in Jerusalem for double-digit generations, and others came later on. And they affiliated with there. Now, the community was under the leadership of these two men. On the right, we have Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, on the very, very far right. And on the left, but also still on the far right, was Rav Yitzchak Yerucham Diskin. Rav Yitzchak Yerucham Diskin was the son of another great rabbi of Jerusalem, the brisker Rav of Yerushalayim, named Rav Yoshua Leib Diskin. If you've heard of the Diskin orphanage, that was started by members of the Diskin family. Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld was the chief rabbi of the Eda Haredis, and they were not too enthusiastic about I should be careful. Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, and this is important to stress because of what developed later on, had a close personal friendship with Rav Kook, and never let any of the ensuing controversy get in the way of a personal relationship with Rav Kook, whom he esteemed as a Torah personality. And I'm not just saying this to engage in apologetics. Sometimes you'll find that the people say, "Oh, they didn't really disagree. They didn't dislike each other. They really actually liked one another very much. They try to downplay rabbinic controversies." You won't find that here. I'm not the type of person who tries to do that. I am saying that they did maintain an excellent personal relationship, the two of them. It was the students of Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld and of Rav Yitzchak Yerucham Diskin that ginned up controversy as a result of who Rav Kook was and what he stood for. In some ways, Rav Kook was actually more conservative than his Haredi counterparts. It's also true that because Yerushalayim was, and to some degree still is, a small town, there was a lot of intermingling between these two different, let's say, camps. So, for example, Yitzchak Yerucham Diskin, in his youth at least, was quite modern. In Europe, he was well-groomed. He was well-versed in secular studies. He was married to a woman who was considered to be modern by the standards of Jerusalem at the time, in that she wore a wig, a sheitel, which in the days of Yerushalayim, those days in Yerushalayim, women wore tichels, they wore kerchiefs, and many of them shaved their heads. But so for a woman to wear a wig, that was considered to be a very modern thing to do. He actually corresponded with Theodore Herzl. Rav Kook, you saw what Rav Kook looked like. He had a shtreimel, he had a long coat. He went to the mikveh every morning. Rav Kook lived an ascetic lifestyle. For Rav Kook, food was mostly a distraction. It was what he ate in order to live. but he didn't actually really care about it. He went to the Kotel every day and every night, and he had certain views, as we mentioned, that are very decidedly not modern Orthodox. One of Rav Kook's students or friends, name was Rabbi Chaim Herson. Later in life, he became the rabbi of Hoboken, New Jersey, which many people don't associate now with having a large Jewish community. Back then, it wasn't. Rav Herson was he dedicated himself to thinking a lot about what a Jewish state would look like, and so he got involved in this controversy. And he said that Rav Kook. He wrote, Rav Kook was chosen to be the rabbi based on the majority of communities here. But the problem is that the Hungarian community, who had affiliated with the Adafridas, they discriminated against the Russian and Polish Jews. The Hungarian, if you are of Hungarian origin, I apologize for what I am about to say. He said that the Hungarians, he said their problem was that the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim was not Hungarian. And it's very important for them that he is Hungarian, because then they get to line if the Hungarians control the purse strings, they get to line their pockets. Essentially, that's what he said. And Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who, by the way, was he was from Slovakia. He came from Slovakia to Yerushalayim, and he said that everybody knows Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. He's a very nice man. He's a great Torah scholar. A leader, he's not. It's not. Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld was quite a leader, but he said everyone knows that he's too old, he's frail, he's not a rabbi, he never was one, and he's too old to involve himself with communal matters in any way. Rav Chaim Herson had a very strong anti-Hungarian prejudice. Look at this. I have it over here as well. No Hungarians, because he says that this is not a new issue. Our Hungarian brethren, when they settled in the land of Israel, from the time the Hungarians came to Israel, everything went downhill. Discord and separation have proliferated. They do have serious Torah scholars, he was forced to admit, and among those Torah scholars are people who are really righteous as well. But the problem is that there is a national affliction to Hungarians. See, wherever the Jews have been exiled, they have picked up the national characteristics of the place that they have gone to. Some of this is good. The German Jews are straight, and they are punctual, and they are rigid, right? So for better or worse, right? Wherever they go, in other words, they pick up the sort of the stereotypical national character traits. And in Hungary, he writes, that national character is to fight and to create tears that cannot be mended. They have given themselves the community that the Adafridas formed. There was a community called Shomrei HaChomos, the guardians of the walls, as if God appointed them alone to be the guardians of the city. These zealots think that they are all that, and they're obviously not, but they have arrogated themselves this kind of responsibility and this kind of title. And of course, all of this, this whole problem, all the controversy surrounding Rav Kook can be traced entirely to the fact that the people who were antagonizing him were Hungarians. This is the controversy around Rav Kook. The Orot is published in the year 1920, and immediately aroused the ire of the rabbinic establishment. Orot really is the statement of many of the principles of the Degel Yerushalayim organization. So what is so controversial about it? First, we have to see what it says. So a number of important ideas that he discusses. First of all, why is it that a process of a casting off of any type of religion, secularization, it happens specifically and especially at a time of redemption? In other words, if returning to the land of Israel is of redemptive significance, why is it that there is so much secularization, so much leaving of religion? How is it that among the people that are leaving religion, the youth, we find such strong idealism? what should our relationship be with Zionism, right? And especially when Zionism, there was, of course, a religious Zionist movement, but the leading lights of the secular Zionist movement were often rabidly anti-religious. Should we be supporting in a religious way the Zionist movement, or should we wait for some type of revealed redemption at the hands of God? What should a Jewish state look like? If it is being run by, or should it be run according to religious grounds? How should we revive the Jewish people? How can we harmonize the different cultures that have arisen among the Jewish people? In other words, you have Jews who come from Middle Eastern countries, and they have a certain culture. You have Jews that come from Western European countries, and they have a different culture. And how do they kind of mix? So these are the questions that Orot addresses. And Orot is in several different parts, several different sections. Orot Me'ofel, which talks about Eretz Yisrael. There's Orot Hatchiyah, talking about the revival of the Jewish people. And Orot Yisrael, this is talking about the greatness of the Jewish people. And there are a number of controversial ideas that really set people off when they read what was in it. So, for example, here we see, in the days, this is chapter 43, in the days prior to the arrival of the Mashiach, the Messiah, the souls of the sinners of Israel who are connected to all matters of the Jewish people, the land of Israel, the revival of the nation, are more refined than the souls of the most devout Jews who don't have the advantage of a feeling for the good of the community, the building of the land, and the nation. The idea is that what Rav Kook writes is that those secular Jews, and not just secular, perhaps even anti-religious Jews, who are involved in building the land of Israel, they are on a higher level, perhaps even, than those who are fully observant but are not doing anything of the sort. For Rav Kook, the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, is an essential part of what the Jewish people are about. And therefore, only the land of Israel can be a source of creation of a Jewish identity, an authentic Jewish identity. A Jewish person can only be fully authentically Jewish, according to Rav Kook, in the land of Israel. And so anybody who's involved in building the land of Israel, these secular Jews, as opposed to God-fearing Jews who are enclosed in their small world, they are of an extraordinarily high level. We call their nefesh, right? Their soul is even more refined because they're involved in the building of the Jewish people and the Jewish nation, the Jewish land. In the same way that wine cannot exist without dregs, so too, the same way that the dregs preserve the wine, so too does the coarse desire of the wicked create a vitality and a life force for everyone, including the middling, the Beinonim, and the righteous, Rav Kook writes. The idea that those people who are rebellious, those people who have rejected Torah, they still serve a purpose. The purpose of what we call kfira, of denying God. There is a value to those people because it really serves to strengthen everybody else. Another example, talking about the Jewish youngsters who were involved in physical activities, as opposed to activities of the mind and the spirit. Rav Kook writes that the spiritual power of the most elevated righteous people who engage in the unification of the holy name, that is enhanced by the exercises that these youngsters do. They're being involved in such physical things. Now, don't be surprised if there are deficiencies in the lifestyle of those who are dealing with the physical, because the divine spirit requires separation from mixing in with the impurities that are mixed in with it, so it becomes purified and clarified and sanctified. So these people who are involved in physical things, there is a value to what they are doing because it serves to purify and clarify the spirit of God that's in the world. you can imagine that these are not ideas that are necessarily accepted or acceptable to some in the religious establishment. For example, there was a ban that was pronounced on the writing of Rav Kook, that they see this booklet by a local rabbi, and they say that this is absolutely, this is forbidden. This publication is too much. Other things that he wrote, okay, but this is too much. And anybody that reads it is reading poison. And it is forbidden to study them. We told him, he didn't listen, and now we have to publicize this ban to the public, especially because of what he writes in chapters 43, 45, as we quoted, said that the things that people who are secular, who violate the Shabbos, are doing holy things. How can you denigrate the pious and praise the wicked? And as a result of this, we are banning the book. It is signed by Yitzchak Yerucham Diskin, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, and several other members, several other Yerushalmi individuals, Rav Yitzchak Frankel, Rav Moshe Nachum Wallenstein, and this fellow Moshe Yosef Hoffman, who we will encounter shortly. They were not the only ones that opposed the Orot. Rav Yosef Yedid Halevi, who was the rabbi of the Halabi, the Aleppian community in Jerusalem, of which there was an old and venerable one. He wrote a letter to Rav Shlomo Eliezer Alfandari, who was also known as the Saba Kadisha, the Holy Grandfather, who was the chief rabbi of Damascus, and later in life, he moved to Tzfat. He died in Tzfat in 1930. So he died 10 years after this whole episode. And he says, please, he writes a letter to the Saba Kadisha, who is the leading light of Syrian Jewry everywhere. He says, please do something about this. This is a rabbi who has destroyed the honor of the Torah. He has come to elevate himself above these Ashkenazi rabbis, Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, Rav Yitzchak Yerucham Diskin, who vastly exceed him in Torah knowledge and in fear of God. Of course, not many people exceeded Rav Kook in Torah knowledge or fear of God. But he writes that this person is so arrogant that he writes this book, and he's writing things, slander, he writes, slanderous things, Dvarim shel dofi, v'divrei api korset, and heresy that's against our holy Torah. So somebody needs to do something about it, please. And he writes, uveli safek, there's no question in my mind, he writes, that this work, shesefer hanal ta'un sreifa, that it needs to be burned. We talked about book burning in the past. And he writes, I am certain that this book needs to be burnt, so that no one else is deceived and no one else follows it. Now, there were those who supported Rav Kook. For example, the great Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, the Rosh Yeshiva of the legendary Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, where pretty much anybody who lived in Yerushalayim was educated. Any rabbis were taught at the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva. So Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, he knew Rav Kook still from Volozhin, and he says that anybody who is a student of Rav Kook should read what he writes and read it carefully, like this work. And everybody should publish his books, all of them, and therefore, and they should, which he worked so hard to write. Everybody should write. Everybody should listen to what he says, and everybody should publish his. Should publish as much as possible to publish his works. Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap, his student, wrote a response to the people who were attacking him, and he called it Tovim Me'orot, which is a play on words derived from the Kel Adon prayer on Shabbos morning, Tovim Me'orot, and it's using the word orot as well. The originally the ban, before the ban was signed, the signatories called for an arbitrator to come and try and mediate the situation. And the problem was that every attempt that Rav Kook's side made to explain what he meant was met with scorn and derision. The only person who could really do this, they needed to find someone who was acceptable to the Adafridas, the hard-line Haredi side, and also acceptable to the Rav Kook side, who was also extraordinarily religious, but a different perspective. And who did they find? His name was Rav Mordechai Alter. He was the Gerer Rebbe, the Imre Emes, at the time living in Poland. Ultimately, he moved to Yerushalayim in the 1930s, before the war. Now, why the Gerer Rebbe? Before the Holocaust, Ger was one of the largest Hasidic groups, the largest Hasidic group in Poland. So the Gerer Rebbe is an extraordinarily powerful person, and he was the spiritual leader of the movement Agudas Yisrael, which started as a social movement, a youth movement, became a political party, and he's the spiritual light at the time, and he was the leader of the most numerous Hasidus in Poland at the time, and also he was a great Torah scholar and a saintly individual. Now, it happened to be that the Gerer Rebbe had a teacher in Yerushalayim named Tzvi David Hirschbein, was an elder Ger Chassid who had fallen in love with Rav Kook and his teachings. And he sent actually 2 letters in which he excoriated the zealots that poisoned the relationship between Rav Kook and Rav Diskin, and how Rav Kook and Rav Sonnenfeld worked so well together. They had such a warm personal relationship. Rav Kook and Rav Sonnenfeld used to travel to these moshavim that we mentioned earlier, and used to do almost like revival meetings, encouraging them to repent, helping them to try and keep a mitzvah. So the Gerer Rebbe came to Yerushalayim on April 12th, 1921, and he paid a state visit to Rav Kook. Rav Kook's student, Rav Moshe Tzvi Neria, wrote that this was the first time that a Rebbe paid a visit to Rav Kook, as opposed to Rav Kook paying a visit to a Hasidic Rebbe. The Gerer Rebbe was apparently an excellent politician, because he gave each side credit as the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, Rav Sonnenfeld and Rav Kook. There were signs that went up denouncing the Gerer Rebbe, but that eventually subsided. It never really held water. Rav Kook wrote this letter about the saintly qualities of Rav Kook, that he's a person of many-sided talents in Torah. He has noble traits. Also, he loathes money, meaning the issues of this world meant nothing to Rav Kook. The same is true, they say, about his son, Rav Tzvi Yehuda. He was not a person, he's a person who lived in this world, but he was not a person of this world. But he says the problem is that he is too full of love. Essentially, that's the problem. He loves Zion, he loves Eretz Yisrael, so he has lost all proportion when it comes to anything that has to do with Eretz Yisrael. And he loves Jews so much that he always looks at the good in them, which is certainly wonderful. But he kind of, if I had to paraphrase it in one sentence, is that Rav Kook's mind is so open that his brains fell out. That's in a certain sense what he says. Rav Kook is a very nice person. He's a fine character, but he also, he was just too kind. He said, though, this maligning has to stop. No one is allowed to attack Rav Kook anymore. And he said that Rav Kook should agree to attract, which he did, some of the more controversial passages. To glorify the athletics of sinners and flatter them, that's too much. He has to clarify and retract some of these more controversial passages, and that was the final verdict of the Gerer Rebbe. Now, Rav Yaakov Moshe Charlap fought to include these very passages, which now you'll find them in editions of Orot. But at least Rav Kook was cleared for that community on charges of being a heretic. Rav Chaim Herson felt that Rav Kook was too much of a softie, that he took this lying down and he didn't need to. Now, we mentioned this Moshe Yosef Hoffman that right over here, Moshe Yosef Hoffman. What happened to him? Now, it seems that they got off scot-free, except that that's not true. One of them, or both of them, Moshe Yosef Hoffman and another person named Meir Semnitzer, they were arrested by British authorities and put in jail and fined for distributing dangerous propaganda, possibly seditious propaganda. So this whole thing came to bite them in the behind because they were viewed as being dangerous. So they said that Rav Kook was a moser. Rav Kook was handing them over to the authorities. He reported them. And there is a prohibition in certain contexts of reporting a Jew to secular authorities when it's going to end up being dangerous for them. Obviously, a lot of this doesn't apply these days, but that's what they felt, and they demanded that their cases be heard in the Batei Din of Rav Yosef Chaim, in the Beit Din of Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld. Rav Kook asserted that they never coerced anybody, they never reported anyone. So they summoned them to an impartial Sephardic Beit Din, because they wouldn't go to Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld's Beit Din because he signed the ban originally. So the opponents admitted that Rav Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld never knew about any of these letter writing campaigns, and what happened was that's when the jurisdiction was handed over to the British Mandate. And once the British Mandate got involved, the controversy against Rav Kook died down, more or less because it became too dangerous. They realized if we're going to get arrested for this, it's just not worth it. Now, as we always have to ask the question, did the ban help? So I think you know the answer by now. The ban did not help. There is not one religious Zionist yeshiva that doesn't have a copy of Orot. In fact, the set of Orot, there's not just this Orot, there's Orot HaTshuva, Orot HaKodesh, a number of volumes of Orot. And it's published by Mossad Rav Kook, and in some communities they call it the Shas Halavan, Shas referring to the Babylonian Talmud, and this is in a white cover, so it's not actually the Babylonian Talmud, but in the same way that every Jewish household has should have a set of Babylonian Talmud, they should have a set of Orot. So Rav Kook, there's a Orot on the Haggadah of Pesach. So everybody has the Orot, and it still forms the ideological basis of the religious Zionist and certainly the right-wing religious Zionist movement. It is still considered controversial in more Haredi circles, and you won't find a copy in a more Haredi yeshiva. In more liberal circles now, it's also become controversial because it is in a certain sense, it is a heavily nationalistic document, right? It's a religious Zionist document. It's a nationalist document. It's a very messianic thinking document. And in subsequent generations, the more we would call the more violent, the more strident religious Zionist elements were ideological heirs or were students of Rav Kook or grand students of Rav Kook. So in more liberal elements as well, it's regarded with suspicion as something of a dangerous document, but it is withstood the test of time. It endures. You can find translations of it as well. There are many commentaries written on it, and banning the book never helped. It just continued going strong. Rav Kook's yeshiva continued to grow. Merkaz Rav continued to grow, and even to this very day, many people can trace their Torah lineage to Rav Kook, and their studies, their yeshivot also are the heirs of the students of Rav Kook. So this is the story of Orot. another book that was bold, brilliant, and banned. I thank you all for the opportunity to study together with you these past 3 weeks. It's been really enjoyable preparing and presenting, and I hope that you've gained something from it as well, and that we will have the opportunity to study things together, together with the Shar community, with my community, Sharei Tefillah in Dallas, and many others, at some point, hopefully soon. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, please feel free.
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Besides the Haredi, are there any other groups in Israel that are still very much against the writings of Rav Kook?
As I said, now there seems to be something of 1 second. Let me end the. In some liberal circles, it is regarded with suspicion for what the writings could lead to, not because they're not important or meaningful, but because of kind of what could happen as a result of them. But in the more Haredi community, they just it's almost like it doesn't these writings are not, they don't play a role. Actually, it's interesting. Point something out. The leading halachic authority of the Haredi community for several decades until his passing, his name was Rav Yosef Shalom El Yashiv. He lived in Mei Asharim. He died about, I think, 10, 12 years ago. He was over 100 years old. Rav El Yashiv was a student of Rav Kook. Rav Kook was his shadchan. Rav El Yashiv was married to the daughter of the noted tzaddik of Yerushalayim, Rav Ariel Levine. Rav Kook was the shadchan. He fixed them up. And Rav Kook was the Mesader Kedushin. He was the rabbi that officiated this wedding. Rav El Yashiv held great reverence for Rav Kook. And if he ever heard anybody of the community that he led, the Haredi community, speak negatively about Rav Kook, he would vehemently excoriate them. The story is told that he once heard one of his own relatives speak like this. And he made him have a set time to study the writings of Rav Kook, and then that relative actually opened a kollel, an institute for the study of Rav Kook's works in the Haredi community. So as much as what I said is true across the board, generally there are obviously exceptions here and there.
And why were the liberals suspicious of him?
Because Rav Kook, as I said, the people that often are consider themselves the heirs of Rav Kook are the militantly right-wing, often heavily nationalistic, yes, religious Zionist community. So people who feel like that is not a good thing may view the writings of Rav Kook that espouse those ideals with suspicion.
I wanted to first say I really have enjoyed these lectures and learning with you. It's been really interesting. So
thank you so much.
A lot of great takeaways. Just a quick question. I'm just wondering, because just superficially of hearing this, it would seem to me that there's a lot of it of his teachings that would be complementary to a lot of teachings of Sephardi rabbis and their philosophies and ideologies. And I was just wondering if you could comment on that.
I think that's true. The question is which came first, right? In other words, was Rav Kook developing these ideas on his own at the same time as these Sephardi rabbis were? Were they influenced by the thought of Rav Kook? Was Rav Kook influenced by their thought? I don't think it's that. But I think that certainly a lot of this was happening at the same time, and in later years, especially religious Zionist Sephardi rabbis were influenced by Rav Kook for sure.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay.
Did you ever study in any of these yeshivot in Yerushalayim?
I studied in a yeshiva, which maybe you've heard. It's called yeshiva called Kerem B'Yavne. It was the first Hesder yeshiva.
Yeah.
The first yeshiva to combine army service with Torah study. And very much the rabbis there the founding Rosh Yeshiva was very much a product of the Haredi community, the Lithuanian ultra-Orthodox Haredi community, but many of the rabbis were students of, not of Rav Kook himself, but of his son, of Rav Tzvi Yehuda. So very much so they consider themselves to be direct heirs to the tradition of Rav Kook and among the original heirs of the tradition of Rav Kook. Although Rav Kook's yeshiva, Merkas Harav, does not have military service. The many of the graduates go for a much abbreviated military stint at the end of 10, 11, 12 years. But that's not actually officially part of the curriculum.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for letting me join you. It was really a privilege. I hope I'll have a chance to meet you in person. Obviously, those who are from Dallas, I will see you in person soon. But the rest of you, I hope to have a chance to meet in person, and we will learn together then too as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Erev Tov.
Erev Tov.